Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ashley and this is Faithful Rattos. So welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. This video is going to be different to the videos that are normally on my channel and different from the videos that will be on my channel in the future, but I just needed and wanted to share this experience with you, and I felt that it was important to share what I've learned as well. So before we get into the actual video, I just like to say a little disclaimer that this situation will be different for everybody if you go through it, and there's no one this is the way to deal with it, this is the way to treat it. That just doesn't exist, sadly, and what works for us may not work for you. And please don't use this video as a step-by-step guide to get through it, because I don't think that I have all the answers. I'm just sharing my answers. And secondly to that, none of this is it's not meant to terrify you or to put you off getting dogs vaccinated if you have to or you prefer to or any of that. I don't want this video to come across that I think no dog should get vaccinated against kennel cough, but I think it's a risk that rat owners and dog owners alike should be aware of and should be told before they make that decision. I don't think people should be making that decision blind, especially if they are rat owners. That's basically just a disclaimer for this video. I just don't want my experience to come across like it's the only way to handle this. How I thought I would go about this video is to briefly go over a timeline of events of what happened, then answer some questions that people had that maybe weren't covered. But before I go into depth about what happened, I would like to tell you a little bit about Bordetella. So Bordetella bronseptica is a bacterium, and it's one of the bacteriums that is the main cause of kennel cough in dogs. Now, it can affect other animals as well. Cats can get Bordetella, rats can get Bordetella, guinea pigs. I don't know the whole list, but a lot of animals can get it and are affected. However, dogs aren't usually fatally or seriously infected with this. Usually they can get over it by themselves and they don't even need antibiotics. For rats, it's a different story. Bordetella pertussis, I think I'm saying that right, is a related bacterium, and this is the bacterium that causes whooping cough in humans. So you can see the severity of the bacterium at play here if you think about whooping cough. Its incubation period is about 7 to 10 days. It can last in surfaces 48 hours, even longer in some cases. And also it can live in soil for up to 45 days. So this is really important for rat owners who go through this, who may have a bioactive setup. It can live in soil for up to 45 days, which is a month and a half. That's what Bordetella is, and it's fatal in rats, as my story will share with you. It's fatal and it's severe, and it's not fatal slowly, it's fatal very, very quickly, which is why I think you need to be aware of the risks, because once it's started happening, it's really, really hard to stop its progress. In the case of one individual rat, it's really hard to stop its progress when they're already sick, but it's also really hard to stop the spread of it throughout a mischief, because obviously rats need to live in groups. Do you want to say hi, Benny? Is that what you want? This is Bentham. He's Russian Burmese. He's a survivor. He survived the outbreak without getting sick. So, this happened to me in July. It started, what I assume it started, on the 10th of July, which was a Sunday. Akatosh had been acting very kind of slow and a bit lethargic, and he had quite heavy breathing. Nothing majorly concerning. I wouldn't have called it side sucking or anything like that, but he was struggling. So I took him to the vet, and because it was a Sunday, the only vet that was open was the emergency vet, and the emergency vet that's near me isn't well versed in rats, so they gave me some Baytril and some painkillers, some Metacam, and sent me home because it wasn't super worrying, and also it was quite a hot day, so the belief was maybe he was just struggling with the heat, because it was quite a big rat. And then by the evening, when it cooled down, he seemed to get better, so I didn't really think anything of it. And then the next day, a similar thing happened to Coram. He started to have a little bit of heavy breathing, but nothing like majorly concerning, and wasn't into moving very much. But it was, again, it was a hot day, and so I wasn't like super concerned that anything was going on. I think now, looking back, I should have been, but I wasn't, and so that was that. And then on the Tuesday, in the afternoon time, Periite started exhibiting similar symptoms. And now Periite wasn't a well-bred rat. Periite was a rehome that was bred for a pet shop, whose owner of the pet shop told me he wasn't a purebred rat, which just shows you what they knew or didn't know about breeding. And he was struggling. And he went through phases of it being a little bit worse and then a little bit better. You want to go back? Okay. However, it wasn't immediately concerning. At this point, I was like, something's going on. And so as it progressed, it got to about 10 p.m. and his breathing was very, very concerning at this point. And so again, I called up the emergency vets and I headed in with him. And at this point, I didn't really know what to expect. I knew it was a pretty dire situation, but I didn't know everything that was about to happen. And they took him in and they put him in an oxygen tent and they gave him an injection of steroids and they gave him an antibiotic orally. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what they gave him. And I sat there and waited for about an hour and a half. Now, because it was an emergency surgery, there wasn't like a super amount of people there and they were dealing with a traffic collision and that patient kept crashing. So they were very busy at the time. So I didn't really hear anything about how he was doing for an hour and a half, 2 hours almost. And then when they had a break from this other patient that was finally stable, they came out and they said he is not looking good. His breathing hadn't been improved at all by being in the oxygen tent, and the steroids, which should have kicked in by now because they did them via injection, they hadn't, and he had continued to struggle and struggle and struggle. And so I said, okay, it seems like this will be a quality of life call right now. And so they took him out of the oxygen tent and they brought him back to me and I spent a little bit of time with him and he was struggling so much. And given the fact that he was still struggling and worsening on oxygen, I just didn't see a way for him to comfortably survive this. I didn't feel like it was fair to put him through this when neither the steroid nor the oxygen had helped him to feel comfortable. And so I made the decision to have him put to sleep because he was struggling so much. It was so severe, it was so sudden, and nothing that should have worked actually helped. Now, I don't think that having an animal, especially rats, for respiratory distress on oxygen long term is a solution because they have to come out of the oxygen chamber at some point. And the question is, if they're going to struggle when you take them out of the oxygen chamber, is it worth it having them in that very stressful environment? And so I decided to let him go, and this was about 2:33 a.m. And then I went home. I got home about 4-ish, and I went to sleep. And I woke up at 7 because obviously I'd been quite overwhelmed with this situation. And I came in to check on Akatosh, and he was in a really rough shape. I want to say he was struggling worse than Periite had the night before. And so again, I went straight back to the vet. And they put him on oxygen and they gave him some antibiotics. And we went home because that was an emergency vet that wasn't, clued up very much in rats. There wasn't anything that we could do except see how he did on oxygen. And that vet had a lot of surgeries to do. So there just wasn't anybody that would be able to see us. Which I regret having Akatosh on oxygen for 5-6 hours that he was on oxygen, because if it's needing that long, it's something else has to change, but that's what happened. And we went home, and at that point I called up my regular mobile vet. She's called Adele, and she's absolutely wonderful, and without her I don't know how I would have like gotten through this. I called her up and I said, like, I explained the situation, what had been going on, and she was like, right, something is happening and we need to figure out what is going on. Now, 2 necessarily isn't a pattern yet, it's a line. So, but given that Coram had been having similar symptoms that Akatosh had the day after Akatosh, we were like, okay, something is going on and we need to try and figure out what it is. And the idea of something like contagious came, and we considered 2 other contagious viruses that can cause outbreaks similarly as quickly in rats, and one of them was Stav, SDAV, and the other one was Sendai, and these are both viruses, so they're a very different like kettle of fish to Bordetella, because technically you can't treat a virus, you just have to treat the symptoms and support bodily functions until the virus is killed. However, they didn't quite fit the symptoms and like the bigger picture of what was going on. So we settled, I'm glad we settled on this, we settled that it was most likely Bordetella. And at this point, we talked about having Akatosh post-mortem if he wasn't to make it, because Pyrite was already frozen at that point, and you really need like defrosted to get a better outcome of what's going on. So we discussed that and we stayed home, and I had been due to go back into the vet about 2 in the afternoon, and I looked over at the cage and Coram was deep breathing again, very, very deep, and Pullman was like fast breathing, a lot faster than normal, and so we took them both to the vet with us, and we made the call that Akatosh needed some peace. He had been on oxygen for 5 or 6 hours, and like Pyrite hadn't made any improvements. He'd gotten worse. He was more stressed. He was very clearly breathing more laboured, and when I held him, he felt like he was ready to go to me, more so than Pyrite did. He was just laying in my arms, which isn't an Akatosh thing to do at all. And it was a very difficult decision, but we also decided to let him go too, because I couldn't see how he could get out of this, given the fact he'd been on oxygen for 6 hours and had still worsened. And I was absolutely devastated, obviously, but I still had 2 actively sick rats to tend to, and so they got a shot of dexamethasone, I think it's called, and I was prescribed doxy, and I already had like the Baytril, and so we went home, and the steroids seemed to help them, which was really great. And again, I spoke to Adele, and she prescribed me some doxy, just have, no, hold on, stop. And I spoke to Adele again, and I told her that 2 more rats had gathered symptoms, and she was like, right, okay, we need to act. And so that was on the Wednesday, so this was like the 13th of July at this point. And everybody was put on antibiotics at that point, because now we had 2 dead rats, 2 sick rats, and 4 rats seemingly unaffected at this point. And so we were like, okay. Then we made the arrangements to take Akatosh up to the veterinary pathology lab at Nottingham University, which, by the way, those staff were absolutely amazing, wonderfully kind, super fast, super reliable, really easy to get in touch with, like amazing. Like if you need any pathology doing and you're in the Midlands, I really recommend them. They're also sort of a little bit cheaper than other places because they are a university. Then we made those arrangements to take him the next day, and when I woke up on Thursday, which was the 14th of July, Coram and Pullman had worsened, and I was very worried about their breathing at that point. So we decided to go back to the vet and get another shot of dexamethasone because it seemed to help them the last time. Now, it took quite a while for it to help Pullman. He was struggling a little bit more than Corin was, and I was quite worried about him at this point, and I wasn't sure whether this would actually help him. And then that was time for me to go and take Akatosh up to the pathology lab. And so we took him up to the pathology lab, and by the time I got back, they had both improved. And at this point, I had a little bit of hope, but I was very cautious about it. We had a prescription from Adele to get some steroids and, as I mentioned, more doxy, which is doxycycline, which is an antibiotic. And so the fastest way to get these medications, because she's a mobile vet, was for her to write a prescription and me to go to my local human pharmacy who had these drugs. And so we went up to the pharmacy, we got these drugs, and we also stopped in the corner shop. And I will show you this little Beanie Baby that we found. Hold on, let me go and get it. So this is a little Beanie Baby that we found, and it's actually, I think it's a mouse. But it's weird because this shop doesn't normally sell toys like this. But Adam saw it and took it down off the shelf. Adam is my fiance. And its birthday is the 13th of July, which is the day that we lost Akatosh. And so it felt like a sign to, you can get through whatever this is. And it helped me a lot on that day. And it is also very cute. And there hasn't been any more Beanie Babies in that shop since, which is so weird. And so we went home, and we just had to wait and see if anyone else would develop symptoms, if Corin and Pullman would pull through, and that was that. And we gave them a steroid in the evening orally, and they seemed okay. And then on Friday, which was the 15th of July, it was very difficult to get them to take their medication in the morning, which it hadn't been in the past. They'd easily taken it. And as the day sort of slowly went by, the fact they hadn't taken all of their medicine, especially the steroid, they had worsened quite a lot, and they were very much struggling. And at that point, I was weighing up whether it was worth to get another shot of dexamethasone, or whether it was unfair to do that to them, because going back and forth to the vet all the time when you're very sick is very stressful, especially for a rat. Also, having that high and low of coming off the steroid, was that fair to them? And I spoke to my vet, and I spoke to Adam, and I decided it wasn't fair for them to have these massive peaks and troughs and to struggle so much in between them. And at this point, antibiotics should have started to kick in, but it didn't feel like they had. And I just didn't want them to struggle anymore. I didn't want them to go through this any longer. And also at this point, we had been forecasted extreme heat in the UK. This was during the heat wave, which made the situation a million times worse. We had been forecasted 30-degree weather and 38-degree weather, and I just didn't know how I'd keep them comfortable through that heat wave. And that was also part of my decision, because I didn't want to have them struggling because of what was happening to them, and I didn't want them to struggle going forward. So at that point, we went back to the vet and we said goodbye to them. At this point, we had the call from, this was on the Thursday evening, sorry, I forgot to mention it. We had the call from the lab that they had found that Akatosh, I don't know how they had examined him so fast. I was expecting them to get to him the next day, because that's what they told me over the phone. But I had been informed that they found that he had bacterial pneumonia, and they'd taken a swab for culturing to figure out what exactly that was. And at this point, it was still unclear whether it was Bordetella, or whether it was a virulent strain of myco even, or something else entirely. But at this point, we needed to know what was at play so we could best choose antibiotics to fight that specific thing. It was at this point as well that we switched from doxycycline and Baytril, and we switched to doxycycline and homoxicillin, because these should work better for what we were dealing with. And over the course of the weekend, it seemed like everyone was doing okay. I struggled quite a lot with my mental health at this point, and I won't go into it, but it was pretty bad. I felt very defeated and overwhelmed, and I felt like I let my rats down, because we didn't know where we caught it from. We don't see dogs. We hadn't been to the vet beforehand in the incubation period. Like, we hadn't even been out, like, at all. We didn't leave the flat during the incubation period when we were, like, supposed to have picked it up, except for one day when I went to uni. So we really don't know where we got it from, which makes sort of the situation, like, a million times worse. But at this point, I was struggling a lot, and I felt that something was off with Hester, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it, and nobody else could see it. And that was very difficult for me to deal with as well. At this point, Cade had also become congested. Now, we don't know whether that was my cooling measures, because it was very hot at this point, but they both ended up being on the oral steroid. It was still dexamethasone, but it was an oral version of it, just because of his breathing changes and his congestion. And then Monday rolled around, which was the first of the 2 super hot days. Now, I managed to keep the rule... Oh. The Queen is under medical supervision. Wonderful. I managed to keep that room very cool compared to the outside. I think I managed to keep it at 24 degrees inside, and it was like 38 outside. I really don't know how I managed to do that, but I managed to keep that room that they were in quite cold compared to outside anyway. But they were still struggling. And it was on Monday evening that Hester really started to struggle, and this is when I became quite concerned about him. Now, he wasn't struggling in the sense that he was in respiratory distress, but he was very clearly unwell and very clearly not himself. He had the silent... I want to make that clear also, I didn't experience like any loud breathing, not like the pigeon noises or the clicking, nothing. Like, even holding them up to my ear, I didn't hear like anything abnormal from their breathing. It was just really, really laboured. So his breathing had become more laboured, but it wasn't to the point where I was like worried immediately for him. And so we just carried on with what was going on. He was taking his medicine and like all of that. And then on the Tuesday, which was the second hot day, Cade started to become unwell too. And I was at this point, I was like, no more rats are getting sick. Like, this stops. This has to stop. Like, it was so, like, I can't express like how overwhelming it was. So over the course of the next few days, they continued to take their medicine, which was good orally. I didn't have to syringe them or anything like that, which I was worried about. But as the days went on, they weren't making improvements. They were getting worse, which didn't make sense to me because they had been on antibiotics for, at this point, a week now, and they were still getting worse. Now, I don't know whether it was just too strong for them to deal with, or whether we should have added a different antibiotic in. I don't know, but that's what happened. And then Hester lost a significant amount of weight seemingly overnight. You could see his spine, and he just looked frail. He looked very, very unwell. And then the next day, which I think was the Thursday, which is Thursday the 21st of July, Cade also seemingly lost weight overnight and was struggling more and more and more. And then on Thursday evening, Hester wouldn't take his meds orally, and I had to syringe them. And now this is one of the worst experiences of rat keeping for me. He was emaciated pretty much, and he was very unwell, and he was quite weak, but he was still fighting against me and this medication. And it was horrible. It was horrible for him. It was horrible for me. And I didn't think it was fair, given the state that he was in, to do this to him again. And so I hoped and I hoped and I hoped that he would take the meds orally in the morning. And in the morning, he was a lot worse again. And Cade refused the meds in the morning. And I tried and I tried. I even tried syringing it, but both of them got so stressed by this that I just didn't see how it was kind to do this to them when they were struggling so much. And it was a very difficult decision, but we made the decision to let them go together that Friday on the 22nd of July because it didn't feel like there was anything I could do to help them. They weren't getting better and they were just struggling. And they were quite old boys. They were about 21, 22 months. They were struggling and it was just not fair for them to struggle any longer. And they'd stopped eating and they stopped being themselves. And yeah, so we let them go on the 22nd of July at the vets. Now, that was the end of the death, and that is the end of the story, as it were. It was confirmed to be Bordetella by the cultures, and our 2 remaining boys, as you've seen, are fine. They never expressed any symptoms, and they'd been on the antibiotics up until, I want to say, maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. So they were on the antibiotics for a good 5-6 weeks, I think, from the start of everything, and we're now almost 7 weeks past the last death and nothing more has come, so it's very likely that it's over, which is why I've decided now to make this video. So this is like an amalgamation of questions that people asked on Instagram and YouTube. Some people asked similar things, so that's that. So early warning signs, how did it differ to normal respiratory infections? So for me, it differed in the fact that normally when people have rats with respiratory infections, normally they're noisy. Either they have like the pigeon noises, or they're congested, or there's like clicking in the chest, or there's like noises going on, maybe not audibly but with a stethoscope. But my boys were pretty like normal, like noise wise, up until when they were like very much in respiratory distress. It wasn't before that they had any like audio, or like I couldn't hear a difference in their breathing. I think the early warning signs is the fact that there was more than one rat presenting with very, very similar symptoms suddenly, and these rats were unrelated, like with completely different backgrounds. I think it's quite good to be a little bit cautious when you have group animals when one gets sick, but if 2 get sick very close together with similar symptoms, is something to look at. Now, it might just be a coincidence, but it's something to keep a watch on, and I feel like that's probably the only early warning signs that you could have, unless, you know, you knew for sure they'd been in contact with the bacteria beforehand from like a dog or whatever. How do you prevent it from happening? Now, normal disease control, so that's good hygiene from when you've been out or when you've been interacting with other animals outside or other people's pets, is changing your clothes, washing your hands, keeping your hair up and away to prevent like the transmission. If you have a dog that has Bordetella, it's very strict quarantine between them. If you have a dog that's vaccinated for Bordetella, to keep that, again, that quarantine between the 2 animals and keep them as far away as possible. I would even go as far to see if somebody could look after the dog or look after the rats while that's happening, so you don't have to worry about them being in the same airspace. What is a testing diagnosis process? So there's no one set way to diagnose or like test this. You can do swabs from a live animal, but they're not going to produce as good cultures as swabs directly from the lungs, because there's not as much bacteria in the mouth as there would be in the lungs. And so I think cultures can be very slow. One, it took a week for the culture to come back. It's best not to rely on waiting for the culture before doing something, but given, I think a lot of the times, the symptoms, the context, and also doing that culture to be sure is a good thing. The only reason we were 100% for sure what happened is because we did the post-mortem and we had the culture done. But before the culture came back, it was still a best guess. Then somebody asked where do I think I got it from? We literally have no clue. As I mentioned before, like, it's most likely either I picked it up on my way to uni, at uni, from somebody else's dog who was vaccinated or had kennel cough, or had kennel cough and wasn't showing any symptoms, so like their owners didn't know, or it came on like some form of post or deliveries. But again, I don't know, and I don't know whether it would be easier if I had like someone or something to blame for this. A nice DM person actually blamed me for this when I shared the infographics on Instagram, which was very nice. We don't know where we got it from, and I don't know whether I want to know. I don't know what I would feel about if I did know. How common is it? Now, I don't think it's super common, but I think it's more common than it seems. I don't think that enough vets and rat owners and rat and dog owners are aware of this. And I don't mean to like disrespect like a vet's knowledge or anything, but if you're not specializing in rats and small animals, it's not something that's going to be like super on your radar or something that you deal with a lot. So I don't think enough vets know about it, which means that I don't think enough people are knowledgeable then to get a post-mortem done or have the experience to say that these symptoms seem like it's Bordetella. So I think it's probably a little bit more common than it seems, but it's not super common at all. There's a handful of people who've experienced it who are active in the rat fancy, but it's not something that happens all the time. It's not like, oh, somebody is always having it. But yeah, it's not super common, and it's not like a huge concern. It's not something that you should be worried about on the day-to-day, but it's something that to be cautious about, especially if you know a dog that's unwell with kennel cough or Bordetella or has had the vaccine since its life. What was the cost of vet visits and medications? So I don't know off the top of my head. I think I worked out the other day, and I included, I think I said over £800 in the infographic, but if I include vet visits, travel expenses getting to the vet since we don't drive, medications, euthanasias, other death-related costs, the post-mortem, which we haven't actually paid for yet. If I look at everything, I think it's probably over £900, which isn't uncommon for an emergency when it comes to rats. Emergency surgeries can be that much on their own. So that's why people say having a vet fund is so important, or having a way to be able to pay for vet care is so important, because things like this can happen and it's your responsibility to deal with them, and they're very expensive. And the last question that I've got on my notes is, has it put you off going to shows? Now, I'm not gonna lie, it did a little bit put me off going to shows to begin with. However, I'm a very extroverted person. Don't mind Aldwin chewing on the toy from Boggle Buddies, but I'm a very extroverted person and I really enjoy shows, and I think they're very important for the rat fancy. I think they're very important, even as a pet owner, to take your rats to a couple of times to get like idea of the condition and all of this sort of stuff. But they are a place where disease can transfer, so you have to be sensible about which rats you take, whether you go yourself, whether you take rats with you at all. We are on like a little quarantine from rat shows and other ratty people for at least 8 weeks, maybe 14 weeks, which takes us either to mid-September or to the end of October. It's not put me off going to shows completely, but it has made me very, very cautious in this like leading off period to make sure I'm not bringing anything with me. Now, that's not to say that outbreaks don't happen at shows. They do, and they have done, but it's not something that happens all the time, because people are sensible, and you should be sensible about going to shows. And that goes for minor things like lice and things like that. You shouldn't be taking an unwell rat to a show, and you should be sensible about all these things. So it did put me off a little bit from going to shows, but it didn't put me off entirely from going to shows, because I think they're super important, and I think with the proper mitigations, they're not going to cause outbreaks all the time. They do happen, very sadly. I was reading on the NFRS forum about many different outbreaks that happened. However, it doesn't always happen that way, and yeah. So that is the end of this video. It is remarkably long. My raw footage is at 38 minutes right now, So who knows how long this actual video will be. If I didn't cover anything that you'd like to know, please leave any questions down below. I just wanted to make this video to share my experience because it's something that I think is helpful for me to process how I go about things, and I also want to share an honest pet keeping experience. And this is something that I went through, and we lost 6 of my boys because of it. So it's been hard. It's not been easy, but I think having these 7 weeks now since it happened has helped me to process, and having my 2 boys survive it and still be with us and still be incredibly affectionate has been amazing. And the support that I've had from people online, from the Rat Fancy, from friends and family, from my wonderful vet and the emergency vet that I saw, it has really given me hope, I guess. And it really helped. So if any of you did send me any words of encouragement or advice or just kindness, thank you. It really did help, and I'm really happy that this community is that type of community. And yeah, so I won't ramble anymore about this because this video is super long and I don't even know what I said really. But that was my experience with Bordetella. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to do a little montage of my boys that I lost to appreciate how they lived, because all of them, up until they became unwell and were struggling a lot, they all retained their quirks and their silly little qualities about them. And I want you to be able to say goodbye to them too, because I know a lot of you did care about them as well. So thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.